Okay, let's talk about this concept called a yield curve. A yield curve. Now, every financial asset is some form of IOU. So if we're talking about a bond or a T-bill, we're saying somebody is going to ask to borrow money. And when they borrow that money, they're going to give a certificate, some sort of T-bill or bond or IOU back to the person, says, okay, I want to borrow this $100,000 here, and I want you to pay it back. Well, they need money, and so if you will loan us $100,000, we'll pay you back in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 6 months, or whatever, at this percent interest. Okay? And then they sign it, and then you give them the money, and they give you the IOU. They give you the bond with a certain maturity date. Now, if you go into a bank and you see certificates of deposit, they say, well, if you put your money into a CD, a certificate of deposit, you'll get this amount of interest right here. But if you guarantee that you'll leave it in there for at least 2 years, well, then you'll get a higher rate of interest. And you leave it in there for 5 years, you get a higher rate of interest over that time. And leave it in for 10 years, you get a higher rate of interest. So the normal yield curve, if this is the maturity dates of 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, etc., tends to go like that. So if we have a bond or a T-bill that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, it will have a higher yield interest rate than one that's only a 6-month. If you're only going to loan me the money for 6 months, I'm not going to pay you as much as if per year as if you're going to loan me the money for 5 years. Now that is a normal yield curve. And the reason is because you got to pay them more if they're going to keep it for a long time, because they got to give up their money for a lot longer period of time. They got to wait for their money a lot longer, and so you got to pay them more if you want to borrow the money for 6 years than you would have to pay them if you only want to borrow the money for 6 months. And that just reflects the time value of money. I like to have money right here, but if you're going to make me wait to get my money, well, then you're going to have to give me a higher yield, a higher interest rate, if you're going to make me wait for a couple of years. Now, this yield, the yield could be, well, how much effective interest are you getting? What's on here at 10%? That might change because the interest rate could go up or down, and the price of bonds is inversely related to the interest rate. So let's say that this was a 5% note, some sort. And if the Fed funds rate, the local interest rate, goes down to 1%, well, this becomes more valuable because it's paying 5%. So people will pay a premium to buy this instrument because it's paying 5%, where everybody else can only get 1%. But on the other hand, if the inflation rate and the interest rate goes up from 5% to 10%, well, then the yield, the return on this bond, what people are willing to pay for it, goes down, because why would I want to buy this thing for 5% if I could go to the bank right now and get something for 10%? I got to wait 3 years to pay me for 5%. You have to discount it down in order to get your cash back out of it, in order to make it liquid. So that's what this yield curve represents. Under normal times, that is a normal curve. But what if people become very nervous about the future? What if they're not confident about the future? When people become nervous and not confident about the future, it's like a bird in hand's worth two in the bush. I kind of want to have my hands on my money right now. I don't want to have it tied up for a long time at a fixed rate of interest if I think that there could be trouble in the financial markets, if I think the economy could be in trouble. I don't want to have to be waiting. I might need some cash. When that happens, we get what is called an inverted yield curve. Rather than going up like this, an inverted yield curve tends to go down like that. Tends to go down like that. Well, why? Because people want to have their money out there on a very short lease because they want it back very, very soon. And nobody really wants to have their money strung out this long. Now, it has always been a rule of thumb that if the yield curve ever becomes inverted, that's like a weather report saying a hurricane's coming, you better batten down the hatches, you better get away from the coast, this is not looking good. If the yield curve ever becomes inverted, that's a classic case that investors in the market don't want to be long in the market, they want to be short. And so the yield for short-term instruments is bigger, greater, than for long-term instruments. In other words, people want this, they don't want that very much. So an inverted yield curve is a classic indicator that people in the market are afraid of the immediate future. Now, because that's such a classic case, because that's such an obvious indicator that the market as a whole thinks that a tsunami is coming, there's trouble coming, that the Fed will come into the market and deliberately try to bring these rates down to about here and bring these rates up to about here, bring this up to about here. In other words, it will sell these short-term instruments, sell them, make them plentiful to drive the price from here, drive the price down. And it will begin to buy these instruments over here, which will tend to drive the price up to force the yield curve to look normal again. Again, the Fed doesn't want this inverted yield curve to be out there obviously showing that there's danger, there's risk, because that can psychologically feed on itself. So this deliberate attempt by the Fed to get rid of this inverted and to artificially drive these prices down and these prices up is called Operation Twist, trying to twist the yield curve. Called Operation Twist. Trying to correct a situation that shows that there is trouble brewing and that people really want to be close to their cash and they don't want it to be out there a long, long ways away and waiting for it for a long time. So the normal way that we would look at instruments that we don't pay very much interest for short term, but we'll have to pay you a lot more to get you to keep your money in there for a long time. That psychology's reversed, that there's a higher yield on the short instruments and a lower yield on the longer instruments. Now that's how the government tries to artificially correct an inverted yield curve. With this responsibility to regulate financial markets, the Fed has to forecast, and it gives signals for what they want people to believe that they're going to take the economy by publishing or signaling what their intent are by showing, by influencing the interest rate, the discount rate, Fed funds rate. But every forecast that we make, when we make that forecast, people tend to take that information and they tend to act differently based on that information than if there was no forecast at all. And so by virtue of making a forecast, it actually changes people's behavior. And this is true for regulatory action as well. The more the Fed tends to twist or artificially manipulate the economy, the less effective their tools become, because people are saying, oh, they're trying to do this, well then I'm going to counter it with this over here. Rather than a self-fulfilling prophecy, sometimes it turns into a self-defeating prophecy. And that's one of the reasons that the Fed says we can't tell the public what we're doing with our open market operations, or they would respond to it. They would know in advance what we're going to do. They would respond to it, and then all of our planning will be not. We have to do it in a way that people don't know what we're doing in order for our actions to accomplish the ends that we want them to accomplish. So that there's a law called the law of diminishing control. The law of diminishing control. That the more you use an instrument to artificially control the economy, you find that you have to use that instrument more and more and more to get the same outcome, to get the same effect. The more the Fed uses a tool to manipulate the economy, the more ineffective that tool becomes, is the law of diminishing control. Now I want to say one more thing here about the Fed and regulations and government regulations, because the Fed is a regulator of the economy and the money supply. And in the history of regulatory bodies, beginning with the Interstate Commerce Commission, was the first one, that these regulatory bodies are kind of like a Band-Aid to fix a problem. Rather than let companies make mistakes and then be fully responsible for the consequences of their actions, since that can hurt not just that company but other companies, we're saying, well, the government ought to regulate this industry, regulate that industry, and the Fed's in control of regulating the financial industry. That in the history of government regulation, there's been this continuous problem called regulatory capture. This continuous problem of regulatory capture. I mentioned the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was created in order to regulate real estate or railroad rates going from one state to the other. And some people complained that the rates were too high compared to somebody else, and that's not fair, and so we've got to have a government to regulate these railroad rates so it's fair for everybody. And it wasn't very long at all until the experts on that Interstate Commerce Commission were executives or lawyers from the railroad industry itself. So what happened was, rather than have regular low rates, but in some stretches there could be high rates, and it was unfair that you could go through this whole state at one low rate, but once you get over here, where the mountains here and there's Great Lakes here, and you got to go through here, and they really jack the rates up, you got to pay 10 times as much to go through this area here as you did this whole area back here, and that's not fair. We got to do something about that. They're gouging people, so we have regulatory rates. So in order to make things fair, what ultimately happened was, yeah, they brought that down a little bit, but they brought all other rates up to make them match. Now it's fair, right? They made it fairer. But what happened is that on the whole, rates went up and revenues for railroads went up. That sort of solution came about like, oh, it's not fair. Oh, we'll make it fair. We'll make it higher for virtually everybody. Now, when the regulators run the regulatory commission, it's like letting the fox be in charge of the chicken coop. There's always the incentive to make the regulations be of benefit for the regulated companies themselves instead of the customer's highest goal and priority. It's more the companies who are the ones that need to be looked after and get the best treatment. Now, I'm suggesting that this concept of regulatory capture is also a problem with the Fed, the Federal Reserve. That the very Wall Street companies and large banks that the Fed is supposed to regulate and manage to keep from being bad and taking advantage of the public, that institution of the Fed now becomes a tool, a financial tool, a legal tool for the benefit of the people that are supposed to be regulated. Now, once the government, through its regulatory bodies, says, okay, what this company is doing is okay, we put our stamp of approval on it. Now it's operating outside of a market economy which says, well, I better be careful with this investment here because they're doing this with derivatives or whatever it is. But hey, the regulators say it's okay. The government says it's okay. They've looked into it. They investigated it. They're responsible. And I tend to rely upon them rather than rely upon my own due diligence and take responsibility for myself. I don't have to take responsibility because that's the government's job. That's the regulator's job. They're there to protect me. They're there to look out for my best interest. If we have regulatory capture, they might not be looking after your best interest, and you really ought to pay closer attention. And it's not really good that the industry now has government control over the very industry that they are in. When something goes bad that has been approved, now it's the government's job to fix it because they were the ones that allowed it to happen in the first place. So now it really is their problem to fix it. When we have institutions in the financial arena, which are really, really concentrated around the money center, primarily Wall Street, and it was the Wall Street banks and Wall Street money and Wall Street strategy that brought about the Federal Reserve in the first place. And they were arguing, oh no, we don't give us a Fed. The Fed will control us and we don't want to be controlled by the Fed. And it's that old story about don't throw me in that briar patch, right? Oh no, please don't throw me in the briar patch, anything but the briar patch. And that's exactly where they want to go. So they really manipulated public opinion, thinking that we need these regulators to control these greedy Wall Street banking types, when really it's the Wall Street banking types that was actually creating and drafting the legislation for the Federal Reserve itself, because it was in their best interest to control panics and to be a lender of last resort. So when we have these very large institutions that are doing these risky things that are okay because the regulators say they're okay, and the regulators say they're okay because they're going to make the company more money to engage in that risky behavior. Now the government says, oh, well, we let them do it, so we got to protect them so that the customers don't get hurt too, but protect them as well. Those are called bailouts, and Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, was a form of a bailout. Now once we start bailing out these companies that do very risky things that were legal, they were legal, the regulators said it was okay, but they are very risky and they blow up. Now we have the concepts of an industry or of an institution that is too big to fail. It's too big to fail. In other words, we cannot allow this institution to fail. Now we're already to the end of the game. Rather than having a small problem of a small industry going down in flames, it's been protected, and so people have false confidence in it, so it gets much bigger than it ordinarily would. We have a problem called moral hazard. Moral hazard. If the government bails out these banks when they did this legal but very risky behavior, and statistically it's just a matter of time until it catches up with them, and we bail them out, now that moral hazard says we're almost guaranteeing that those companies are going to do the same risky behavior again because they make so much money doing it, and if it blows up in their face, they don't have to worry. The government will bail them out and save the day. So we can have these very profitable, risky investments, and we don't have to worry about the consequences if something bad happens, because it's a regulated industry and the government's going to be responsible for taking care of the customer and taking care of things when they go bad. Now we are actually economically giving incentive to do the very things that we don't want people to do. It's kind of like, okay, you're 16 years old and you don't have a whole lot of experience driving a car, but here, you take the keys and I've got insurance, so no matter what happens, if you smash the car, it's going to be okay because I've got insurance. And every time they smash up the car, it doesn't matter, they get another one for insurance, and I got it locked in for insurance rates. So it takes away the consequences, the bad consequences for the very behavior. We don't want them to wreck the car, but if we tell them every time they do wreck the car, here, have 2 cars now, or have 3 cars now, then they're going to continue the same behavior, and that's called moral hazard. Doing the very thing that we don't want them to do because they're rewarded by doing it. A classic illustration of moral hazard, let me give you one that's just going to be really, really easy. Let's say a family really likes their family dog. Love their family dog. So what they do is they decide to get a $100,000 life insurance policy on their family dog because they really like their dog. Now, let me tell you, any family that, or any insurance company that's stupid enough to put a $100,000 life insurance policy on a dog, that's like the dog's death certificate right there. I mean, when it comes to $100,000, the first trouble that family ever has, what do you want, sweetheart? You want this dog, or would you like a $100,000 payoff if it happens to run out into the street? That would be a moral hazard to the dog. Rather than protecting the dog, having something to try to protect us from a loss, we're actually going to make it a death sentence for that particular dog. That'd be a case of moral hazard, because the very thing that we're supposedly trying to insure against, that's the thing that we would have an economic incentive to see happen. And that can be the case, and can be argued that is the case, within the financial regulatory bodies as well. Too big to fail and moral hazard tends to go together.